Hi everyone, and welcome to the Lake District. I'm out in the garden, as you can see, making the best of the sunshine in lockdown. Disappointed that this isn't happening in real life, and I get the opportunity to meet you all. But I am very grateful for the opportunity to be able to make this video and talk to you today. Whether we're still in lockdown or we're coming out of it, I hope you and your family are doing well. Anyway, so when I first had a conversation with Mike Buchanan about the domestic abuse focused conference, we were talking to each other. We hadn't spoken before, and we were talking to each other about how I got into this particular field. And Mike thought it would be beneficial for me to discuss part of why I've got into this field. But the title of my talk today is Controversy, Idea Laundering and Woozles: How the Gendered Paradigm Hides Male Victims of Domestic Abuse. It's a bit wordy and a bit academic, but what I'm hoping to do today is talk you through how I got into the field, but also why some of the reasons why we are where we are as far as the information is concerned around the dominant narrative of the gender-based model, and how that has an impact predominantly on male victims, but also for everyone that's involved in that horrific situation. So if we start with why and how I got into this industry. I have a supervisor called Professor Nicola Graham-Kevin. I have no doubt that many of you have heard of her. And I'm very lucky to be supervised by her. But we sometimes have a little bit of a gallows humour because, as you can imagine, what we do all day, every day can be sometimes quite dark. And when I first met Nikki and I was discussing the prospect of doing my PhD, I was also sharing my motivations behind that. And after we'd spoke, she joked that I could be a poster child for the gendered model. And this is because I am a victim, survivor, recoverer, whatever you want to label that, of domestic abuse. My ex-partner used all the various elements that we now recognise as coercive control, whether that be physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological, sexual or economic. And one of the most distressing things you can go through, I feel, once you've been through that situation and you feel you're on the other side, is what I'm labelling post-separation domestic abuse. Because I managed to get out of the relationship and also managed to get divorced relatively quickly. So I think it was in the space of 9 months. However, I was dragged through the court system for more years than I was actually married. For the first 3 years, I had a legal representation, which cost me tens of thousands of pounds, because I had entered the system, as it were, just as they were going through the change of legal aid. And because I was working full-time, of course, I wasn't eligible for legal aid. However, my ex-partner was. And even though it had changed quite quickly and quite early on into that particular battle, he was still allowed to claim legal aid for the entire length of the years that these battles continued. And the battles are around, for those of you that haven't been in this situation, they are around two distinct areas. One is financial, and one was about children. So you can often be hit with two hearings within days or weeks of each other. And that's what happened. So because he was legally aided and his solicitor was combative, I would be dragged into the court sometimes twice a month. And that absolutely dominated my cognition, especially when I was representing myself, because you have to learn the law, you have to prepare documents, you have to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row, as it were, and then you have to prepare to face your perpetrator in family court proceedings. And the stress of that, I would absolutely put on par with the abuse that happened within the marriage. It was exhausting, but it gave me an insight into that entire system that I hope most people don't ever get, to be truthful. But for those of us that have been through it, or those that are in the midst of it or about to go through it, I think it takes such a level of understanding that, and I don't believe that there is a whole system that's biased. I do think there are particular individuals that have a biased view of that situation and domestic abuse and family proceedings. But I do think there are an awful lot of people that don't. And because I look at male and female victims' recovery, I hear very similar stories on both sides of that coin. And I think in certain circumstances, individuals have felt grievances in that situation, regardless of whether they're male or female. However, we know that the norm, as it were, is that children will stay with their mother and fathers get visitation. So there's already a stacked deck before we get into that situation. But one thing that really led me down this particular path was that there was one hearing where we were in a magistrate's court instead of family court, so we had 3 judges. And I was quite good at holding my emotions and trying to get the information that I'd prepared across to the judge, and in this case, magistrates, in quite a calm and logical manner. And that's not to say that on the inside I wasn't absolutely shattered, but it meant that I was in a better emotional state to present my information, surely for the way I saw that. Now, because I was able to do that, the statement was made, and I don't think it was made maliciously. I think it was almost not a disbelief, but a miscomprehension or a processing, because one of the people in that court actually said, "You don't sound like a victim." And that made me think, well, it made me, it kind of kicked the wind out of me a bit, but it made me think, so what does a victim sound like? And led me to start looking into the whole, or certainly linking the whole images of what a victim is presented like to the public and the public's perceptions of that victim, and then how that is snowballed into various areas of your life. So we all know the pictures of the domestic abuse charities putting out the woman cowering on a chair somewhere while this shadow of a dominant man with a clenched fist is kind of perched over her, ready to attack. And a lot of the literature that's out there for victims of domestic abuse is really about how devastating the effects are, and how essentially the victims of domestic abuse are broken for life, and how this can have such a long and devastating effect. Now, that's not to say it doesn't, and that's not to say it changes us, but it has implications. It has implications for the victim, because they may not recognise they're a victim because they don't adhere to this template of victimhood. It has repercussions for those agencies that are supporting or treating the victim, because obviously they're looking for this template of what a victim looks like. But also, when it comes to support and treatment, it will be very much based to the gendered model, but also to the broken victim model. So those elements led me into, it certainly took me back to university to do my master's degree. But then as I was going through the research, something wasn't tallying, because of what I was doing. A lot of victims were talking to me, and a lot of people were sharing their experiences with me, both male and female. And none of those people matched what I was reading in the literature. And it just made me think, well, if I'm reading the literature about female victims and that doesn't tally, what else doesn't tally in the literature? And then opened the top of that rabbit hole, jumped straight in, and as I've said in previous interviews, I've not hit the bottom yet. But it made me really deep dive into how the current knowledge of domestic abuse and victims came to be. And that's really what I wanted to discuss today. However, one of the things I would say is why I don't feel I fit in the template, certainly one element, is that none of my background had any domestic abuse in. It was a stable, normal marriage that my parents had. We had very normal working class background, mum, dad, me, brother, very supportive, and not a whiff of abuse. So when I went through that with my ex-partner, I was still very aware that was him and his behaviour. It wasn't all men, because I was surrounded by very good men. In my personal life, I was an absolute daddy's girl. Sadly, he's not with us anymore. He was amazingly supportive. Never had a whiff that I couldn't be anything that I wanted to be in life. There was a completely gender-neutral system in our house. If anything, my mum ruled the house. Great relationship with my mum, but absolutely was a daddy's girl. My brother was amazing. I grew up with him, usual brother-sister stuff. Sometimes we loved each other when we were younger. Sometimes we couldn't stand the way each other breathed too loud. But utterly fantastic. Amazing uncles, cousins. And I worked in a very male-dominated industry initially, in the brewing industry, and the men in there were great. Teammates that I'd worked with, bosses that I'd had, people that I'd managed, great. So it didn't marry up the gendered model of all men or potential perpetrators, just didn't marry up with me. And I suppose because I had that background, it was another reason why I didn't fit into that template of a female victim. But like I said, just jumping back, one of the areas I wanted to discuss was the controversy in the domestic abuse field. And hopefully there'll be a slide up now talking about that. It is very very political, which was surprising to me. Again, as a naive return to academia, I thought this was going to be quite a supportive field. No. There are two distinct models. And again, most of you will know this, but it needs recapping before I go any further. There is the gendered paradigm, which is very much a feminist-centric model. And there's the gender-inclusive model. And they pretty much say what it says on the tin. So the gendered model is based firmly in feminist ideology, and you'll see on the slide that this is the explanation of gender-based violence from Women's Aid that I got from their website yesterday. So it says gender-based violence is violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. So that says a couple of things to me. It is you're a victim by accident of birth because your violence is perpetrated against a woman because she is a woman, which has a lot of impact, I feel, on victims, which I'll discuss later. But then they add on this caveat that or that affects women disproportionately. And this is why we hear this word used as a mantra. It's often switchable or with overwhelmingly. So disproportionate and overwhelmingly are used because this is the monolithic reason for domestic abuse according to the gendered paradigm. So that cuts out a lot of the other explanations that that psychology and sociology and all the other ologies have for why gender violence is at the levels that it is, which also prevents effective tackling of domestic abuse, because how is anyone going to help a female victim of domestic abuse if she is a victim of domestic abuse by accident of birth and or a absolute embedded, apparently for millennia, I keep being told online, social structure? That's it. She's a victim forever if you live by the law of the gendered paradigm, where on the absolute opposite end of the scale we have the gender inclusive model that discusses that, and the quote on here is taken from John Hamill's book, saying that the focus has expanded to a gender inclusive concept of partner and family violence that eschews simplistic causal explanations and takes into account systematic principles and the complex interactive nature of family relationships. Now, we all live in families, and the majority of us live in relatively, in this strange time, normal families. But there is conflict. It is human nature that if you get a group of people together, there's going to be some level of conflict, whether that's just normal disagreement right through to domestic abuse. Now, to deny that as a starter for 10 is not only unrealistic, but to quote a friend of mine, it holds the empirical validity of voodoo. We all know it exists because we all live in families and we all interact with other people that we don't get on with and we have conflict with. So even from the get-go, it doesn't hold. But then what the gender inclusive model also enables is the focus on individuals rather than a power structure. So we can look at previous history and learnt behaviour. We can look at the inability to manage conflict and emotional regulation. We can look at mental illness or trauma responses. So we can actually have a holistic view of the causes of domestic abuse and thereby tackle it effectively. One more thing I'd like to say about the gendered model that I find hypocritical, but also quite worrying, is that if feminist ideology, which has created this gendered paradigm, is about empowering women, why does it make women live in fear? And it's a question that I've put to many feminists directly and online, and no one's been able to give me a distinctive answer yet, which in and of itself is quite telling. So let me just find where I am. One of the other reasons that there is conflict between these two particular models is the numbers issue. And this is a question that I'm asked often online, so I thought I would address it here because it helps us to unpick how the numbers are massaged, to say the least, or completely manipulated is more likely to fit a narrative. So there are, effectively, I hope that the slide's up, it says the numbers and why they are so different. There are 3 different types of numbers generally that we come across, and you'll hear this debate. You've certainly heard me bang on about the reported numbers versus the scientifically robust data as my mantra. So let me explain it. I have searched high and low, and I have asked experts in this field if they have seen a document that says, a feminist framed document for feminist framed research that actually states a number of male victims and female perpetrators, because I get hit with varying opinions of this by self-confessed feminists that range from 99% of all domestic abuse is committed by a man against a woman to about 10% of victims are men, to other stuff. But I can't find anything that nails that in a research paper from a feminist scholar. So when I've asked around, no one can give me an answer, but the direction is, they use crime stats, which leads me to the sort of second section of numbers that are used in this debate, which is the crime statistics. Now, this is the basis for the Office of National Statistics. There is some interviewing in there, but the sort of bedrock is the crime statistics from the police and recorded incidents. That's why we see 1 in 3 of the recorded incidents that are in the Office of National Statistics reports. So I've said this previously, but when those numbers are recorded, they're almost sort of 2 or 3 steps down the line. So the first step is that the victims that are victimised have to recognise that they are victims of domestic abuse as a crime. Now, there's a big distinction between what people perceive as normal or even abnormal, and how that transfers over to a crime. So firstly, they have to recognise it, and there are additional barriers for men recognising that they are victims of domestic abuse, because society tells them they can't be, and the dominant narrative tells them they can't be, because it's generally a crime perpetrated by men on women because they are women. So recognising it is difficult. Then it's the decision of whether you report that to the police or not. Now, for any victim, reporting that incident to the police carries consequences. Those consequences can be bad, as in you can be subjected to further violence or further abuse by the perpetrator. You may split up with that particular partner, so your lifestyle changes, your relationship with your children changes, you might lose your home and that particular lifestyle that you've got. For men, as well as all that, they also have the added bonus of either not being believed or being dismissed as it not being a serious incident, or being thought of as a perpetrator. So quite frankly, the 1 in 3 men that have reported these incidents, wow, amazing. And I know the word brave is bantered around a lot, but courage, certainly, to take that step. So that's where a lot of the crime statistics come from. And also, again on this slide, I took some court data from the Refuge website under a page that says facts, not. So that talks about numbers dating back to 2013. And what you'll find is if you go on these websites under any sort of facts or breaking the myths or anything that they put out there, what you'll see is that they use data that's old or combined or manipulated in some sort of way to fit their narrative, which I'll come on later, which is really disturbing and a bit sickening, actually a lot sickening later on. But on this particular slide, you'll see that the data that Refuge have used is from 2013, and it's CPS data, and it says that 93% of defendants for violence against women and girls were male. Now, again, that's another filter with crime data, because then that has to go through the CPS and they have to see if they've got the right level of evidence, if they've got all sorts of things that make the decision to take them to court. And then when it gets into court, that whole process almost starts again. So we know that the field is stacked against men, and we also know that the criminal justice system is stacked against men, because even in any crime, men are 6 times more likely to be convicted and get a longer sentence for the exact same crime. So using those numbers are layers of bias in and of itself. But it's interesting that they use those particular numbers to fit their narrative. However, this is where my stage 3 or part 3 of the information is the numbers I refer to when I bang on about scientifically robust data. But it also needs breaking down. So I'll come on to this in more detail a bit later. But essentially, the gender inclusive data uses community research. What that means is that it uses random telephone interviews or huge amounts of data about victimization, or even general population data to assess levels of domestic abuse. Not only for domestic abuse being perpetrated against you, but if you have perpetrated domestic abuse against someone else. Now, often this isn't framed as domestic abuse, it's just framed as particular actions. So, because as soon as you start framing something as a crime or actually giving it a label like domestic abuse, people tend to shut down, or they give you an answer that favours them. So when questions are being asked in community and gender inclusive surveys, they tend to try and be as neutral as possible with their questions, not to sway people one way or the other. And all these studies, which are really big studies, and will be a combination of qualitative, so interviews and analysing information from what qualitative researchers tend to call lived experience, and quantitative data to analyse the exact picture of what's going on there. And we've seen these big studies that they are quoted often. So Archer's meta-analysis, Strauss and Stretz, Strauss and Gellis, Dutton. There was also one last year that I'll try and get a link put up for this, from Lesova, Dim and Dutton, which looked at crime data from the Canadian General Social Survey on victimisation. And I think they had about 33,000 participants in that. And the results that came back from that was that 2.9% of men had been subjected to victimisation, intimate partner victimisation, and 1.7 women. So there we're seeing a distinct difference that shows that men are experiencing more partner violence or partner abuse than women. But no one's actually promoting that or screaming about that. So there, I hope I've given you just a snapshot of the 3 different types of data that are used for to support quite political agendas in this field. So how those numbers fit in to a systematic approach to how the gendered model was created? And some of this information is taken from a YouTube video that I watched by Donald Dutton. It's on John Hamill's YouTube channel. Again, I'll try and put a link in for this. If not, just drop me a line. And you'll see on the slide, it's how the gendered data is created. So you'll see a handful of cherries on this slide. There's a number of strategies that are used in gendered model specific data. So one of the things is researching from the conclusion. Now, to not get into the nit-grit of it too heavily, when a sort of gender inclusive researcher in this field sets out to investigate a hypothesis, we're actually trying to disprove it, as it were. We're almost doing the opposite. We're trying to find ways of disproving it, and if we can't disprove it, hopefully we'll get an unbiased answer. And all the systems in science, all the statistic tests are set up to enable a hypothesis to be falsifiable and testable. And within that, what you try to do is not use your bias to sway the participants in those particular areas. And you're going to get some of that, but you can also take that into consideration with statistical tests, and you can actually put it out there. Say, I've targeted these particular people for this particular reason. This is what came back. However, you do need to leave it open. The difference with the gendered model is that they will research to prove what they already think. So they've drawn a conclusion. The conclusion in the gendered model tends to be women are overwhelmingly or disproportionately the victims of male perpetrated domestic abuse. Simple enough. And the way they go about testing that, which they're not testing, they are trying to prove themselves right, is to select a particular sample, which is usually heterosexual female victims of male perpetrated domestic violence. And often this will be in refugees. So they will research people within refugees and we know that most people in refugees are women because there aren't any refugees for men, or very few spaces. And because of the way our population is made up, they will be majority heterosexual female victims. So therefore, their perpetrator will be a man. And then all that data is gathered up, and then it's presented. It will be interviews, and it will have themes. But because those themes are predominantly what was researched from the conclusion, they prove themselves right over and over again. But what you'll find is, as we build up, you'll see how that is completely flawed, because Donald Dutton put this succinctly when he said there's also this idea that they only research those select samples, because if they don't ask, they don't have to tell. So they when they're asking the question of these particular women, and I found this in research for a meta-analysis I've completed recently, where, for example, there's an instrument that is created by Murray Strauss called the Conflict Tactic Scale, and it asks specific questions about if people have suffered specific incidents of abuse, ranging from quite minor to serious, and in the last 12 months, and if they have used those against their partner in the last 12 months. Now, what I discovered in the meta-analysis I've just completed is a number of those studies had used those particular that particular instrument, the Conflict Tactic Scale, but they'd only used it to ask the women if they had been victimised. They didn't ask them the other half of the CTS. There was one study that did use the CTS to its full opportunity. So it asked that particular group of women if they'd been victimised by those actions in the past 12 months, and if they had used those particular actions against their partner in the last 12 months, but they didn't report it. So often they either don't report that the women are also engaging in domestic abuse, or they just don't bother. They don't ask, or they just don't tell anyone. So it's that thing where you've already proved yourself right by just not asking the question. So that's kind of answered the two elements of don't ask, don't tell, and drop female violence from the analysis by not including it if you find it. So cherry picking, we all know this. There's particular instances where the data will also show opposite information, but it will be reported just by focusing on a particular area. The example I have for this is, and those of you that follow me on Twitter will know what who and what I'm referring to here. There's a particular feminist-centric scholar that puts out articles in opposition of any point that you might make. But it was this particular article was around saying that feminists recover better from abuse, and to be honest, I should have it in front of me, but I think it was sexual abuse. But regardless of whether it's domestic or sexual abuse, it is abuse. And they looked at around 32 or 36 women and interviewed half that were feminists and half that were not feminists. So when you first read it, if you read the abstract, it seems pretty balanced, actually. Oh, right, okay, so they've taken two groups, and they've asked them the same questions, and they've asked them, how they feel about things. And lo and behold, when you get to the section where they're talking to the feminists about do they think that their feminist ideals have helped them recover from this abuse, the answer is yes. I feel empowered. I feel able to discuss my experience. I don't internalize this and all the rest of it. And it sounds really good on the surface of it. And then when you start reading what the non-feminists said, it's not right at all. What they're saying is that they find that the feminist model forces them to focus on victimhood. It forces them to have to disclose and constantly talk about what they've been through rather than moving on. So there was non-feminist centric victims in there that didn't want to be glued to this victimhood, stuck in the past, everything's horrific narrative, and actually found this idea that you were empowered by victimhood to be harmful for their recovery. But that's not what was put out there. And that was certainly not what the person that had linked this article on Twitter was trying to claim. And it completely highlights the whole idea of this filtering and cherry picking of what the data is actually showing when you dig a bit deeper. The next point is use of the crime data, which we've already discussed previously, about how they will use already layered biased data to try and claim that women are overwhelmingly or disproportionately victims in this arena. And then there's something called idea laundering, which I'm going to come on to now. Now, idea laundering came from Brett Weinstein. If you don't know who Brett Weinstein is, get on YouTube and go and listen to him. He is I think he's an evolutionary biologist. I also think his wife is as well. And they are currently doing some YouTube videos that are incredible. Very grounded, logical people, very interesting, take on a whole range of subjects. I'm not paid by them in any way, but I do find it fascinating. But Brett Weinstein actually coined this phrase, idea laundering, and popped it on Twitter. I think it was around 2018. Go and check it out. But it was in response to the grievance studies expose that had been completed by Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, where, again, if you don't know a great deal about this, it's a shame that I'm not in the room with you, because we would have to get a drink and talk about this deeper. But again, go on to YouTube and go and check it out. In a nutshell, these are three people that exposed the sort of ideological based journals and way of publishing to the world, even to the point where they got published a chapter of Mein Kampf by just reframing it as a feminist research paper. Go and take a look. But Brett Weinstein coined this phrase that completely sums up how this biased and ideological based research has taken a hold and therefore created this sort of supports the feminist ideology that has created this gendered model of domestic abuse. So it starts by, if I can get a better view of this, by showing that research is conducted from an ideological conclusion. All the elements that I've talked about previously, so all the biases, all the methodology is used to prove the central cause of ideology. Now, previously, these the methodology that's used would not have been published in academic journals because it's not rigorous enough. It doesn't hold when you're using scientific method to follow the path that most of the gendered and feminist-centric models are using for research. So what did they do? They created their own journals. So these journals have I would like to say different standards of rigour, but I absolutely, from my humble and subjective opinion, to steal a phrase, is lower standards. They're not robust. They are ideological in nature, but it gets published and it starts following the peer review methodology that is there to try and make sure that robust data hits consumption. However, if your peers are also of the same ideology as you, as is the journal you are publishing in, then you don't have to hit the high and robust levels of rigour that we would expect in scientific peer-reviewed articles. So this level of data that is then published on these conclusions is then used as citations to support more ideological research and starts to build up a body of knowledge that is not robust and is based in ideology, but has in all stages seems to have followed the same rigorous peer-reviewed process that actual robust scientific data follows. However, at each stage of that, they've just put in their own standards. So when we've built up enough of a body of knowledge that has been peer-reviewed and published, that then gets turned into a module that is then taught in universities as a robust, peer-reviewed, scientific supported part of education, when it isn't. It's been doctored the whole way along, but that has the consequence of producing more people that are ideologically focused, who think that this is the way that scientific method is conducted, and therefore they start contributing in the exact same manner to this body of unscientific, ideological, doctored data and information and knowledge. So over 50 years this has been happening. You know, Murray Strauss was absolutely bang on the money when he said this data is dismissed, people are threatened, it is squashed down, it is tainted by you being called names and a misogynist and anti-feminist and all the rest of it, so that your work is dismissed because nobody wants to touch that hot potato. Nobody wants to see the scrawny finger of misogyny pointed directly at them, because we've all got mortgages to pay, we've all got children to feed, we've all got lives to live. So you are their coercion starts to control the kind of data that is put out there and picked up by these ideologues that have gone through gender studies and these modules that are all supported by this doctored data. And this cycle goes on and round and round, and hey presto, dirty science cleaned by a seemingly robust method of peer review, when quite frankly every single element of that gendered process stinks to high heaven. So you can see how all of a sudden, how when, for example, you see me engage with an academic that's centred in the gendered ideology of domestic abuse on Twitter, you can see why they're fighting, that they think that the data they are using is scientifically robust, because by all intents and purposes it's followed the exact same process as works like Archer's meta-analysis, Murray Strauss, Donald Dutton, that have all followed that robust scientific peer-reviewed method. However, they've got ringers in their method that have utterly changed what each of those stages looks like to fit their narrative. So it is idea laundering in the exact same way that someone would launder dirty money. The problem is that this isn't dirty money, this is dirty science that is used to educate people, that is used in the media to show the public what is happening out there. It is used to change laws, it is used to change policies, and it is used to manage funding. So as much as we would expect someone, a criminal, to clean dirty money, we have to consider the scientific corruption of this method to support ideology. So that takes us to something else that is often used, and it's got a lovely name, but it's for something quite harmful, and I think it's something that we should all be aware of, and it's called the Woozle effect. Now, this is known, the Woozle effect is also known as evidence by citation, and I've touched on that when we looked at idea laundering. or a woozle occurs where frequent citation of previous publications that lack evidence misleads individuals, groups, and the public into thinking or believing there is evidence, and non-facts become urban myths and factoids. Now, I've just explained that idea of idea laundering, that notion of idea laundering, that cycle of idea laundering is actually a giant woozle. But as well as having a giant woozle, we have smaller ones. Bear with me, technology here. And one of the woozles that I find most sickening is this sentence that is often used as a sledgehammer on anyone that is disagreeing with the notion that domestic abuse is gender violence. If you disagree with that, and it's usually within 3 points, it's usually for me within 3 tweets on Twitter that I get hit with this, and it's usually just before I get an ad hominem insult. But it's usually that, yes, it is a gendered ideology, a gendered issue. Domestic abuse is a gendered issue. Then it's usually some kind of stats thrown against me that don't hold ground. And then this, which is 2 women a week are killed by their partner or ex-partner. And again, there's a slide that I hope's come up here that says, woozles used to silence debate regarding male victims of partner abuse. And I took this from Refuge's website yesterday. So this is not something that is going back in history. This is actually what they have on their website now. Refuge, incidentally, are the people that run the National Domestic Abuse Hotline. So this doesn't marry up well, does it? Especially considering that all the politicians, including Priti Patel, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the Victims Commissioner, are telling everyone currently in lockdown that anyone and everyone that is a victim of domestic abuse should phone this hotline. But this is what's backing up the ideology behind that hotline. So this says the facts. And the fact that I've got circled is one that I've just mentioned, which is 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner in England and Wales alone. The title of this section says, The Facts. Now, if you look underneath that part that I've circled, you'll see that there's a hyperlink, and I urge you all to go on this website and have a look at this. That in pink where it says Office for National Statistics, that's a hyperlink that I'm going to take you to in the next slide. 2009. So for Joe Public, if you're looking at this and it says 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner in England and Wales alone, and you've got the Office for National Statistics brackets 2019, one would be forgiven for thinking that those were the very latest statistics. But if you carry on reading, it says homicide in England and Wales ending March 2018, and in brackets average taken over 10 years. So, if you're not someone that's particularly into statistics, which most people that are visiting these websites, I would suspect that statistics are the last thing on their mind because they're looking for help. Most people on these websites are looking for help, or they are other smaller charities looking for guidance from what is supposed to be the leader in this industry. They're looking for information, and they might not have the time or the inclination to sift through the data in the same way that some nerd like me would. But if you click on that particular page, and the next slide I want to take you to is labelled the ONS data 2019. This is what it says. 1/3 of women were killed by a partner or ex-partner in the year ending March 2018. Now, I've highlighted this bit in brackets that says 33% or 63 homicides. Now, before I go any further, I shouldn't have to do this, but I am going to insert the caveat. No one should be murdered by a partner. The fact that these women have been murdered by a partner is horrific. I totally understand the fear and the pain that women go through, and they should not be murdered. However, that does not give anyone the right to use their horrific deaths to silence any other group of victims, and that's what's been done here. But not only are they doing that, but they are lying. They are lying about the numbers. It says 63 women were killed by a partner or ex-partner last year, yet Refuge, under their subheading of the facts, are still using the woozle of 2 women a week are killed by a partner or ex-partner. Now, on this slide, you will see that when the sentence ending March 2018 ends, another one begins that says, this is the fewest number of women aged 16 and over killed by a partner or ex-partner in the last 40 years. Now again, that doesn't excuse the fact that 63 women were murdered by a partner or ex-partner in the year ending 2018. However, coming from a background in business and knowing how hard people work in their everyday life, if I was someone that owned an organisation that was battling domestic abuse in the way that Refuge say they are, and I got some news that said to me, last year 63 women died and it was horrendous. However, that was the lowest number of women that had been killed by a partner or ex-partner in the last 40 years. I'd be throwing a party. I would be shouting that particular statistic from the roof. Everything that we are doing, everything that we are campaigning for is having a positive effect. Less women are dying, less than we've seen in the last 40 years by the hands of their partner or ex-partner. So why the silence? Why have we not heard this from Refuge? This is disgusting. And actually, the more I say it and the more I hear it coming out of my mouth, the sicker it makes me. Because not only is this particular woozle used to diminish male victims and to absolutely squash any kind of debate by using guilt and disgust against anyone that dare even mention a male victim, it's also harmful for women because it's still keeping them in fear. It's still saying to them, you're still at risk, still 2 women a week. So it's heightening that fear, even though that 2 women a week is a very minute. I think I calculated it as, if we use just men over 18 as a population in Britain, and those particular women, the 2 a week that are murdered by their partner or ex-partner, I think the percentage works out at something like 0.0000039% of men that are killing their partner or ex-partner, or women in general. Now, so that if it's 63, that's a lot less that are being killed by that. Yet still, that woozle is being issued to vulnerable people or organisations using these particular statistics to formulate their plan to help victims. It's still being used as fact, when quite frankly, A, it isn't, and B, why aren't you shouting the fact that these numbers are going down? That tells me that their motivation is not about reducing this. Their motivation is about keeping this narrative running to keep their business running. Quite frankly, I find that disgusting. So, this leads me to my final slide. You'll be glad to hear. But I fight hard for recognition of male victims for a number of reasons. One is that male victims need to be fought hard for because they are utterly dismissed, and it's disgusting that any victim should be dismissed in any way. But I also think that this whole narrative that is supported by this dirty science and woozles and lies and manipulation of data harms the very women it professes to protect. And I'll tell you for why. So I'm going to go around this circle, and I'm going to start with male victims and work anti-clockwise to children. So male victims, it's pretty easy to summarise that. They are ignored. The gendered model says that men are the perpetrators of domestic abuse against women because men are men and women are women. And data is dismissed completely. And the knowledge that supports that ideology is laundered. It's dirty science, and it's laundered to create one enormous woozle. Male perpetrators are let down because the entire model is based on Duluth. So it's about educating men on their power and control, not addressing the real issues that might be there. And believe me, I'm not making any excuses for domestic abuse in any way, but it could be a variety of reasons. It could be learnt behaviour. It could be mental health. It could be a trauma response. It could be disorder. It could be all sorts of things that lead a man to perpetrate domestic abuse, in the same way as it would be for a female to perpetrate domestic abuse. However, one of the things I should have mentioned earlier on, but I'll do that now, is that we know that the most common form of domestic abuse is bidirectional. So if that's the case, that male perpetrators are being treated where they're still part of a relationship where the domestic abuse is bidirectional, it's going to help no one. No one's going to get help there. They're just going to walk back into that situation, and the same thing's going to happen again, because the woman isn't treated at the same time. They're not counselled or supported together to get over this. Which leads me to female perpetrators. In the same way that male victims are dismissed and ignored, so are female perpetrators. There are few female perpetrator programs that are in place for them. And those will also be based on the Duluth model, because that's dominant. So they're going to treat women about the power and control wheel. How? By turning them into victims, by telling them that they are victims, which seems to be this the idea that if you're a man and you're a victim, you are transmuted into a perpetrator, and if you're a woman and a perpetrator, you are transmuted into a victim. And that was evident from when the Duluth model was created, which Ellen Pence also admitted that it was imposed ideology as opposed to evidence-based reality. So female perpetrators are going to be let down. And we also know from evidence that one of the indicators of a woman being physically injured is the fact that she's instigated domestic abuse, and 70% of unidirectional domestic abuse is instigated by a female. So if we don't help them, not only are we not helping them to be supported and live without violence, we're also putting them in harm's way of getting physically injured. Female victims. And I suppose in the whole gendered model, this is probably the thing that makes me most angry. Not because they're females and not because they're victims, but because they are used as cattle. They are used to perpetuate an ideology that is not based in evidence. And because of that, women are confined to the template of being a victim forever. They are seen as broken because that's what domestic abuse does to women. It keeps them firmly in their victimhood because it's seen as being empowering to be a victim in some way. And we've seen that in the rise of the celebrity victim. And it would be wrong of me to name the particular people that I'm talking about, but those of us that spend too much time on social media know exactly what we mean. And that's not to say that these people are innately flawed, but they are demonstrating behaviours that are in need of support. But these people are being used to push a narrative that is beyond them. They are really being used to project this, but it also keeps them in that victimhood. It doesn't allow them to move forward or adapt or get over it or whatever it is that they need to do. So it also has the knock-on effect that we are keeping half the population in fear, because women are told that men are perpetrators and they are victims by accident of birth. And this idea that 2 women a week are killed, so that means that any man that you might come across, and I've actually been asked that on Twitter by a woman, how do I know when a man isn't a perpetrator? As if the perpetrator is the norm, instead of the fact that a perpetrator is so far from the norm that it doesn't even make up half of 1% of the population. But that's how women are viewing the world, because this dominant narrative not only keeps them in victimhood, it lurches them headfirst into victimhood, because that's what they're looking for. And ultimately, the victims of this are children, because domestic abuse is not going to be tackled correctly by maintaining this narrative, for all the reasons I've said previously. Then children are going to be subjected to this violence, whether it's bi-directional or unidirectional. They're going to be separated from parents that are not abusive and left with parents that are abusive. And we all know that post-separation abuse is as real as domestic abuse. And we're not going to allow this entire situation to be tackled, so children are going to be left to suffer. And it's sad and rageful and needs to end. And I think we're seeing that happen more and more. There is a body of robust evidence that is in place, ready to crack that nut wide apart. And that's not to say that it's about upending the support that is out there for female victims. Indeed, if you take on the entire picture of domestic abuse, the levels of support for everyone need to be increased, but they need to be effective. You know, this is not about taking one size to fit one particular group and forgetting about all the other. We have social media now that allows big mouth people like me to shout about it, and we have conferences like this that want to bring the focus on it. And I must say, as a female survivor of domestic abuse that works very much along both sides of those camps, but certainly in what is wrongly labelled as a dismissive label as the manosphere, I have never had a conversation with anyone that supports men's issues and male victims that has said to me that female victims need to be ignored. In fact, the absolute polar opposite. They completely agree that female victims need to be supported, but they also agree that men need to be supported as victims of domestic abuse in equal measure. And they also believe that domestic abuse needs to have a better understanding of the causes and the outcomes and how they can be tackled. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you very much for putting up with sitting in my garden and all the various noises that are out here. I think my neighbour is just mowing his lawn, and we've had a few birds and things floating about. But thank you very much for the opportunity to put my point across. If there's anything that you're not clear about, or anything that you would like me to give you links to or send you data about, feel free to contact me. My Twitter handle is firebirdpsych, and I'm sure my email details will put up as well. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic day.